Usually when we think about building a house, we picture an architect drawing up plans, ordering materials, and slowly putting together something beautiful from scratch.
Right, a very orderly process.
Yeah, but imagine an architect who builds this glorious, indestructible mansion using the very wrecking balls that his enemies are swinging to tear it down. Like, the demolition attempts actually become the specific mechanism of construction.
That is a wild image.
Right. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are taking a deep dive into some staggering source material that argues the greatest hostility you face in life isn't, a glitch in the universe. It is actually the very mechanism of your rescue.
It really flips the script.
It does. And to understand how, we really have to go back to the sands of ancient Egypt. But before we get into the history, we need to set the table here.
Yeah, we definitely need to set up the theological guardrails for this discussion. Our sources pull straight from Chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession. And the basic framework here is that God, as the creator, directs and governs all creatures and actions.
Okay, all of them.
All of them. But the crucial caveat is that he does so without coercing innocent people to commit evil acts. Nor does he author sin.
I mean, that's a massive point to make right out of the gate.
It is. His governance is absolute, yet it never violates the accountability of the creature.
Let me just stop you there for a second, because those terms can feel a bit heavy. When we say God governs all actions but isn't the author of sin, what does that actually look like in practice?
Right. It's a good question.
Like, why do we need that specific guardrail before we start talking about Egypt?
Well, think of it like this. God never injects fresh evil into a pure heart. He never forces a morally upright person to suddenly, do something wicked against their will.
Right, because if he did
that, he would be the author of sin, and he would be violating his own holy nature.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the guardrail ensures we understand that when humans act wickedly, the wickedness comes entirely from their own fallen desires. Yet God is still sovereignly managing and directing those sinful desires to accomplish his righteous goals.
Okay, yeah. So taking that framework, I want you, the listener, to consider a highly counterintuitive idea. What if the hostility you are facing at work or in your community, your family, isn't God just turning a blind eye?
Yeah, what if it's intentional?
Exactly. What if that hostility is the very tool he is using to secure your deliverance? We see this happen on a massive national scale in the book of Exodus. So let's look at the late 15th century BC, what was actually happening to the Israelites.
We are looking at the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom of Egypt. This was an era of unmatched military might and architectural triumph.
The golden age, really.
Absolutely. Now, decades prior, you had Joseph, an Israelite, elevated to the position of vizier. His administration preserved both Egypt and his own family from a catastrophic famine.
And because of that, the Israelites were given the best land in Goshen.
Right, they were. But fast forward, and the biblical text tells us a new king arose who did not know Joseph. Meanwhile, the Israelites were multiplying at just an astonishing rate. I mean, this was the literal fulfillment of the promise God made in Genesis to make Abraham's descendants a great nation.
But the Pharaoh of this era, and historians usually point to like Thutmose III or Amenhotep II, he doesn't see a blessing. He looks at this demographic explosion and sees a massive national security threat.
Precisely. Pharaoh operates as a paranoid, calculating political tyrant. He is looking at this huge immigrant population residing within his borders, and he fears they might ally with foreign invaders in the event of a war.
So it's a purely political calculation in his mind.
Yeah, and his solution is brutal. It's systematic. First, he institutes state-sponsored slavery. He forces the Israelites into rigorous labor in mortar and brick, building supply cities like Pithom and Ramses.
Which is horrific enough on its own.
It is. But when that fails to curb their population growth, he resorts to state-mandated infanticide. He actually orders the midwives to murder every newborn Hebrew boy.
Man, from a purely historical boots-on-the-ground perspective, it looks like the promises made to Abraham were just buried in the mud of those brick-making camps.
It looks completely hopeless.
Yeah, if you are an Israelite living through that, it feels like God has completely lost control of the narrative. But the sources point us to Psalm 105, verses 24 and 25. And this text provides a theological reversal that just shatters how we normally think about cause and effect.
It really pulls back the curtain on who is really driving this oppression.
Yes. So Psalm 105 is this historical psalm of remembrance, detailing God's faithfulness to Israel. And verse 25 explicitly states that God turned their hearts to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants.
The Hebrew word used there for turned is hahak. It means a complete overturning, like a radical reversal of a situation.
So it wasn't just passive.
No, not at all. The text insists that God did not simply sit in heaven and watch the Egyptians slowly develop an organic hatred for the Israelites. He actively overturned their disposition from favor to hostility.
Wait, pause there. How does God turn their hearts to hate without violating that guardrail we just talked about? Like, how does he do this without being the author of their sin?
Because the Egyptians were already fallen, idolatrous people, they were not innocent bystanders. Prior to this, God had been extending restraining grace.
Meaning what? Exactly.
Meaning he was essentially holding back their natural depravity so that Israel could flourish in Goshen. When the time came for Israel to leave Egypt, God simply withdrew that restraining hand.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he let their latent wickedness loose, and he sovereignly focused that animosity specifically onto Israel.
So he just aims the hatred that's already there.
Spot on. This targeted hatred set the necessary stage for an eventual miraculous deliverance. The Egyptians chose to hate, but God orchestrated the timing and the target.
That is fascinating. One of the essays uses an incredible analogy to explain this, comparing God's providence to a grandmaster in a chess match.
I love this analogy. It's so good. Have you ever watched a grandmaster play chess against an amateur? The amateur thinks they are launching this brilliant attack. They are moving their knights and bishops, aggressively taking the center of the board.
And they think they're totally winning.
Right. And the grandmaster just sits there, calmly responding. But the grandmaster isn't just reacting. He doesn't reach across the table and physically grab the opponent's hand to force a move. He doesn't break the rules of the game.
Right, he doesn't coerce the amateur.
Exactly. Instead, he perfectly maneuvers the amateur's aggressive, hostile strikes. He uses the opponent's own hostile strategy to trap them in an inescapable checkmate. So Egypt, with all its imperial arrogance, was essentially just a pawn on the chessboard of redemption.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. God governs the sinful heart by directing the creature's innate depravity toward his ordained ends. The opponent thinks they are winning right up until the final move. And logically, this moves us from the general hatred of the Egyptian masses to the specific, stubborn resistance of their supreme leader. We see the anatomy of a hardened heart most vividly in Pharaoh.
We really do.
So let's look at the decree of hardening. What is so shocking here is the timeline. Because before Moses ever steps foot in Pharaoh's court, before he speaks a single word of warning about plagues or letting the people go, God declares his intentions.
The timing is critical here.
It is. In Exodus 4:21, God tells Moses, "I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go." God is guaranteeing Pharaoh's rebellion before the first conversation even happens.
And the lexical precision in the original Hebrew is incredibly helpful here for understanding how this actually works. Moses employs 3 distinct Hebrew roots to describe this hardening process throughout the narrative.
Okay, what's the first one?
First is kazak, which means to strengthen or make obstinate. God fortified Pharaoh's resolve to do what Pharaoh already desired to do, which was rebel.
So he's not forcing him to rebel, he's making him strong enough to keep rebelling.
Right. Imagine a boxer who wants to keep fighting but is getting exhausted. God gave Pharaoh the unyielding stamina to withstand terrifying plagues so that he wouldn't just cave in out of sheer physical fright before the divine plan was complete.
Oh, man. So God is giving him the endurance to sustain his own rebellion. What are the other words?
The second word is kabad, meaning to make heavy or dull. This reflects the insensitive nature of a reprobate conscience.
Okay, so what does that look like in real life? If my heart is being made heavy, what is happening to my brain?
Think about building calluses on your hands from lifting weights. The first time you grip the iron, it hurts. It causes blisters.
Right.
But the 10th time, or the 100th time, the skin has thickened. You don't feel the abrasive iron anymore.
Yeah.
Or think about watching a terrifying horror movie. The first jump scare makes your heart race. By the 20th movie, you are completely numb to the violence.
Yeah, you just don't even blink.
That is the essence of the word kabad. Pharaoh became increasingly desensitized to the destruction of his own nation.
Terrifying. And the third word?
The third word is kasha, which means to make stubborn. These are active verbs. This is an active, sovereign administration over the rebellious mind.
See, this challenges a very popular modern view. The idea that God is just up in heaven, nervously reacting to human choices as they happen. The sources call out theological systems like open theism or Arminianism.
Yeah, they take those head on.
And we want to fairly report what the sources are arguing here. To put it plainly, Those views argue that human free will is the supreme deciding factor in history. They suggest God looks down the corridor of time, sees what humans will do, and then shapes his plans around our choices. But the Apostle Paul picks up this exact thread in Romans chapter 9 and completely shuts that down.
He does. Paul's argument in Romans 9 is a systematic defense of sovereign grace. He looks back at the Exodus narrative and uses the Greek word sklerine, meaning making stiff or intractable.
Okay, sklerine.
Yeah. And Paul places God's unmerited mercy and his act of hardening on the exact same syntactic level. The text states, "So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills."
So they are totally parallel.
Exactly. If mercy is unconditional, originating entirely in the sovereign will of the Creator rather than human merit, then Paul argues that hardening is equally unconditional.
Now I have to stop you there, because this is where everyone pushes back. If someone is listening right now, they are probably thinking, if God is the one fortifying Pharaoh's stubbornness, how is Pharaoh still held accountable for his actions? I mean, are we just looking at a cosmic puppet show here?
That's the immediate reaction, yeah.
How can someone be a pawn on a chessboard, totally maneuvered by the grandmaster, but also be completely responsible for the moves they make? How does that actually work?
That is the most common objection, for sure. And the theological answer is found in the concept of concurrence. Let's break that down. A puppet has no desires. A puppet has no mind, no will, no hatred. It only moves because a string is pulled.
Right. It's just wooden string.
Concurrence means God and man are working simultaneously, but on different levels. Pharaoh was acting freely according to his own rebellious desires. He hated Yahweh. He loved his own authority. He wanted cheap, forced labor.
He wasn't a victim in this.
Not at all. God did not have to inject fresh evil into Pharaoh. The hardening was a judicial act. God judicially confirmed Pharaoh in the rebellion that Pharaoh already loved and pursued.
Wow.
Human responsibility and divine sovereignty function together without canceling each other out. Pharaoh is condemned for real, willful defiance, while God's purpose remains completely decisive over the outcome.
But this raises a massive question. If God is actively orchestrating this resistance, why drag it out for so long?
I mean the plagues.
Yeah. Why subject the land to 10 consecutive plagues? God could have orchestrated a day one rescue. He could have softened Pharaoh's heart immediately and had the Israelites march out peacefully. Why the prolonged suffering?
Well, the biblical answer to that question crushes our human pragmatism. We always want the fastest, most efficient route out of pain. But God explains his motive in Romans 9.17, quoting the book of Exodus.
What does he say?
He tells Pharaoh that he was raised up specifically so God could display his wrath and supreme might. The 10 plagues were not random natural disasters pulled out of a hat. They were a calculated, systematic takedown of the Egyptian pantheon.
I want to look at that because the plagues are often taught like just a random sequence of bad weather, frogs, locusts, hail. But they were targeted strikes, right?
Absolutely targeted. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile River. They viewed it as the bloodstream of the god Osiris, and they worshipped Hapi, the spirit of the Nile.
So what does God do?
He turns the Nile to blood, rendering their source of life putrid. They worshipped a frog goddess named Heket, the goddess of fertility. God multiplies the frogs so drastically that they become a rotting, putrid curse upon the land.
Just completely mocking their gods.
Yeah. They worshipped the sun god, Ras. God blots out the sun with thick darkness that could be felt. Furthermore, Pharaoh himself was viewed not just as a king, but as Horus incarnate, a living deity.
So Pharaoh thought he was a god too?
Yes. And God raised Pharaoh up to this pinnacle of earthly authority specifically to humiliate that claim. God is systematically proving that the local deities are absolute fictions and publicly displaying absolute supremacy over the greatest empire on earth.
And this lengthy public display secured the deliverance of the helpless by making the situation completely impossible to solve through human means.
There was no way out.
There was no political treaty to be signed. There was no armed Israelite rebellion taking down the guards. Salvation had to come through the blood of the Passover lamb and the miraculous splitting of the Red Sea. The text proved that redemption is an act of divine rescue bestowed upon the powerless, not, a cooperative effort between God and man.
God made Egypt an intolerable place for Israel by inciting that initial hatred, ensuring they would long for deliverance rather than assimilate into the pagan culture. Then, by hardening Pharaoh, God ensured the rescue would require an undeniable, history-altering miracle.
One of the essays uses a striking image for this. Pharaoh's hardened, stubborn rebellion acts as the dark velvet backdrop, upon which the brilliant diamond of God's justice and grace is displayed to the watching nations.
Oh, that's a great visual.
Yeah, because when you walk into a jewelry store, they don't show you a diamond on a white sheet of paper. They put it on black velvet. You need that dark background to see the brilliance of the jewel.
Without the dark background of Pharaoh's obstinate rebellion, the watching nations and subsequent generations of Israelites would never have seen the full spectrum of God's holy attributes displayed. We wouldn't have seen his wrath, his justice, or his unmatched might to save.
So if God does this with a political tyrant in ancient Egypt, what about the greatest injustice in human history? How does this play out at the cross?
The Exodus is the supreme Old Testament type of redemption, and it points directly to the Lord Jesus Christ. But the most striking connection lies in this doctrine of providence over human hatred.
How so?
Just as God ordained the hatred of Egypt to bring about the deliverance from slavery, he meticulously predestined the hatred of the Pharisees, the cowardice of Pilate, and the brutality of the Romans to bring about the salvation of the world.
We see this explicitly in Acts, right?
Yes, Acts chapter 4, verses 27 and 28. The early church is praying, and they say that Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place.
I have to be honest, reading the sources here made me a bit uncomfortable. They push back hard on a very popular idea today. We hear so much about Jesus being a victim of a corrupt political system or a martyr who got crushed by systemic injustice.
It's a very common narrative right now.
It is. And to report impartially on what the sources are doing here, these essays forcefully reject that. They argue against viewing Christ as a tragic victim of a broken society. Instead, they argue that Jesus was the sovereignly appointed... Yeah. God turned the hearts of men to hate his own son, pouring out unmitigated wrath upon Christ so that helpless sinners might be saved.
The cross was not God's backup plan after the religious leaders rejected Jesus. If Jesus is just a victim of a broken political system, then the crucifixion is an accident, a tragedy.
Right, just bad luck.
But the biblical reality is that the most heinous act of hatred in the history of the cosmos was predestined by the hand and plan of God before the foundation of the world. God utilized the wicked, willing choices of men to accomplish the greatest act of grace imaginable.
So what does this mean for you, the listener, in your daily reality? The practical comfort here is massive. When you face hostility, whether that is at work, in your community, or in society at large, you can know with certainty that your enemies are on a divine leash.
A divine leash. I like that.
Yeah, God rules over the rise and fall of animosity against his people. This doctrine also completely slaughters the modern idol of self-esteem. We have to realize that by nature, we are carved from the exact same fallen clay as Pharaoh.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
It is, but if we are saved, it is exclusively because God decided to have mercy, not because we were smarter or more moral than anyone else.
This theology provides an iron pillar for the suffering saint. When believers face roadblocks or persecution, the natural human reaction is fear or doubt. We assume God has lost control.
We panic.
We do. But understanding that God governs even the hostility of opponents completely shifts our perspective.
Our sources also issue a really sharp warning to the modern church here. They push back against pragmatic, seeker-sensitive models. You know, the smoke machines, the concert lighting, the TED Talk-style sermons that try to smooth out the rough edges of God.
The stuff designed to make it more palatable.
Exactly. The text argues for the unvarnished proclamation of truth, recognizing that marketing strategies cannot raise the dead.
Because those methods assume that human marketing can change a hardened heart. If we believe that men are naturally carved from the same fallen clay as Pharaoh, then no amount of mood lighting or clever storytelling can wake them up.
It just doesn't work that way.
It requires a sovereign, divine act. We need a theology of suffering and sovereignty, not just better branding.
Let me push back on behalf of the listener one last time with a
Yep.
very urgent question. If someone is hearing this and thinking, well, if God hardens whom he wills and my nature is like Pharaoh's, then I can't be blamed for my sin. I'm just doing what I was programmed to do.
The fatalism argument.
Right. How does the biblical text answer that kind of fatalism?
The Apostle Paul anticipated that exact objection in Romans 9, answering, "Who are you, O man, to answer back to God?" But even more practically, the author of Hebrews provides a terrifying warning directly addressing this attitude.
What does Hebrews say?
Hebrews 3:8 says, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." The biblical warning is this: if you continually, willfully resist the gospel, God may eventually grant you the very thing you desire.
He gives you over to it.
He might stop pursuing you and leave you to the consequences of your own autonomy. Repeated refusal leads to a terrifying judicial blindness. You cannot use divine sovereignty as a get-out-of-jail-free card for your own willing rebellion. The call is always to repent and flee to Christ while it is still called today.
To wrap up our deep dive today, the central takeaway from these staggering essays is that the God of the Bible is not a passive spectator. He isn't wringing his hands in heaven, nervously watching history unfold.
Not all.
He's the active orchestrator of all things, ruling over the hatred of enemies, the hardening of rebels, the exaltation of his own name, and the salvation of the helpless.
He makes the wrath of man to praise him. Every trial, every hostile act, and every moment of suffering is meticulously governed by a fatherly hand to secure the final redemption of his people.
So let this doctrine put steel in your backbone today. Knowing that the darkest circumstances are handled by a fatherly hand changes how you face opposition. Which brings us back to our opening thought.
The architect.
Yes, think about that architect using the enemy's wrecking ball to build his masterpiece.
Mm.
If the creator of the universe meticulously orchestrated the rise and fall of the greatest ancient empire just to display his glory and redeem a group of helpless slaves, how might he be actively using the seemingly mundane, frustrating roadblocks or oppositions in your own life right now to secure a victory you cannot yet see?